Jungle of Belru is a place of darkness and mystery. The only remains of a once destroyed landmass thousands of years ago. There are no sounds of nocturnal insects and frogs, no snakes hiss, no tiger roar or leopard growl, as all the wildlife have now been deceased. One might think due to the lack of food to survive in harsh environments wiped out the animals, but it really wasn't the case. The wildlife in the Jungle of Belru, big or small, were eaten. An eerie silence loomed the jungle, so silent that if there was a mere knock against a tree trunk, this would sound like an explosion. The large canopy blocked out most of the sunlight, but the dense foliage remained the same, that dark, monotonous green with a few lighter shades when sunlight was generous enough to shine through. The fungi, however, seemed strange, unnatural, an unknown species perhaps. An odor of decay and death stuck to the jungle like a wet blanket. However, the unpleasant nature of the environment was not the reason that stopped folk from entering, rather, the inhabitants of the jungle. When researchers and explorers ventured deep within the jungle, they were met with an ominous sound, a primal beat that came from a conga drum or a tamboura. The primal sound gave a warning to visitors of the jungle, a sign to tuck tail and run as fast as one possibly could. The increased volume and tempo of said beat would mean they are closer. This meant that there was no way out. This meant that your death was certain. Then the sounds changed. Screams so loud that it woke people up from their sleep. Petrifying, blood-curdling screams of victims being tortured, mutilated, and devoured limb by limb. Sounds that gave outsiders nightmares and sleepless nights for as long as they lived. The fear of the unknown ran deep within their bodies. Then, as time passed, hearing strange and creepy sounds from the jungle were the least of people's concern. Now they began seeing. Late at night there would be glowing eyes peeking through the foliage, some white, some red. The eyes would blink the same way that an animal or a human did, then slowly fade away into the darkness. But it wasn't the unknown torturing and devouring trespassers, since the only occupants of the jungle were the barbarians. An ancient civilization that coexisted with wildlife just before the explosion. Strong warriors, tall and muscular, 8 to 9 feet tall, both men and women, had cultivated the jungle as their home while protecting the wildlife and the nature around them. Once upon a time, the jungle used to be home to visitors, unbothered by the dangers, since there were none. The barbarians of Belru were respected folk, and while never understood spoken language, communicated in their own. Sometimes people would be fooled by their intimidating nature and their primal instinct, but truthfully, the barbarians were seen as the guardians of the jungle. In today's folklore, however, people often refer to the inhabitants of the jungle as ruthless, vicious, unforgiving, primal cannibalistic barbarians bred for violence. Those who have dared to wander near the jungle have seen the most horrific things imaginable. The barbarians ripped people to shreds with their bare hands. Some have reported seeing a barbarian couple, husband and wife, respectively using wooden clubs and bashing the heads of their victims until there was nothing left. They usually soak their hands in the blood of those fallen prey to them and smear it on their face and body. But that wasn't the terrifying part. The horror that lies in that particular story mentioned the couple they saw were the smallest barbarians. There were others living deep within the jungle, massive giant creatures that were once barbarian, now turned into something far more sinister. These monsters were almost the height of the trees, long sharp teeth, red eyes, and so heavy their mere footsteps shook the jungle whenever they walked. This was a mere urban legend that circulated throughout the land for hundreds of years, since those that tried to document their findings never returned. Now, why is this all important? Why so much emphasis on a jungle that is so far out from the land? Well, the stone tablet needed to activate Victor's trials is located in the heart of said jungle. Without possession of the stone tablet, the demon army can walk freely. While Myra the witch, Bertold the dwarf, and Eleanor the elf are currently gathering allies for the suicide mission, the white wolf sits with Victor near the lake, waiting for his arm to heal, while sharing the story. In order to understand the importance of the trials, what the stone tablet is, how it reached the jungle, and why the barbarians turned into terrifying monsters, then we need to dive much deeper into the history of the world as a whole. Furthermore, you are all probably wondering, why is this dude going on and on about monsters when he has a werewolf in his thumbnail? Well, that's no ordinary werewolf, nor is the jungle named randomly or by location. It's named after Belru, the one responsible for all this mess. The first werewolf that has ever been created. Before this particular world reset, before the formations of Cascada, Hornswell, Redwater, the Land of Freya, and the Harrow, existed one big landmass. In this landmass was a similar timeline that we share today. The fairy tales, rhymes, fables all remain the same, which means that Hansel and Gretel was a story about two kids that pushed an evil witch in the oven. Jack and Jill were never in any danger, and Red Riding Hood was a spooky tale told to frighten children that wandered the woods by their lonesome. The advancement of technology, however, was far behind to what we are now exposed to. Furthermore, no werewolves had ever existed. The entire story of Zeus cursing Lycaon, the king of Arcadia, punishing him by changing him into a werewolf, did not exist. This timeline and this land had no history of mythology. That little difference was soon about to change. Mr. Belru Caesar was a 30-year-old wildlife biologist that worked in the jungle on the outskirts of the land. The young man loved what he did, and being able to study wild animals and their habitats was his dream come true. Since the barbarians never interacted with the outside world before, Belru was the first human that they met. They saw how he cared for and loved not just the animals but the jungle itself, therefore took a liking to him. Belru in return taught them ways to communicate with the outside world. Then people began exploring the jungle on tours and excursions, something they couldn't really do before out of fear for the barbarians and the animals. But with Belru nearby, even the wildest of animals and the strongest barbarians welcomed the humans into the jungle with open arms. The jungle was no more a place of the unknown and fear. It was a place that helped people become one with nature and promote tourism, so much so they named the jungle after Belru. Many believed him to have superpowers, able to tame not only the animals but the barbarians as well. They called him the Animal Whisperer. Belru, however, saw it differently. He believed that he received this gift from God and the angels, since he was so strong in his faith. Mr. Belru Caesar was a loyal servant to the divine, never missed a day of prayer, never skipped a fast, and worshipped God and the angels with his entire soul. Besides him having the gift of being able to speak to animals, he also had premonition dreams. There were always messages in these dreams, guiding Belru, helping him in his life, showing him right from wrong, and these dreams he felt was a reward from the angels above. Then, the man's life of a smooth traveling road with joyful dreams and happiness at every corner took a drastic turn. On one stormy night, Belru had a nightmare of him turning into a horrifying beast. A monster covered in dark fur, coarse, thick and rough. A monster so large and muscular, chest wide, shoulders broad, thick veins running down his elongated arms, but instead of nails, he had claws at the tip of his fingers. Eyes that glowed, eyes that saw deep into your soul, and eyes that instilled fear no matter how quick you looked at them. Teeth long and sharp, jaw wide and strong, nose like a snout, pointy and long. Of course, Belru never knew this monster he saw in his nightmare was called a werewolf. With a loud thunder crack, the young man tumbled off the bed and crawled underneath, his face dripping with sweat, clothes and hair soaking wet. Belru closed his eyes tight with fear while saying a prayer under his breath. The storm intensified, the rain and winds heavier than ever, and the lightning so consistent and bright it felt like a giant spotlight in the sky turning off and on. Belru then became more startled by a hand reaching under the bed. A woman's hand with porcelain skin, warm and welcoming. A voice echoed in Belru's room, saying,
"It's okay. Take my hand. I won't hurt you."
Belru, still spooked by the nightmare, the storm, and the hand of an unknown person speaking to him, slowly crawled out from under the bed. Whimpering, fearful for his life, his entire body had suddenly calmed down with extreme relaxation. But this was the aura of the angel standing in front of him.
"My name is Jorah. I am one of heaven's angels. Please, there is no need to be afraid of me. I'm here to help you. Everything is going to be okay."
Jorah was a beautiful woman with light brown skin, her hair silky soft, long and wavy. Belru's thoughts of wondering whether she really was an angel soon diminished when her large feathery wings opened out from her back, so large that it almost filled the entire room, both height and lengthwise. Jorah then explained to Belru that she was the one responsible for his dreams, guiding him and helping him to fulfill his destiny. A loyal servant of the divine to destroy the demons in hell once and for all. The nightmare was a piece of her mind and a foresight into the future. The angel then explained the terrifying monster that showed up in the nightmare was referred to as a werewolf from other worlds and timelines, a monster that hell would love to use at their disposal. But the angels had a plan. If a loyal servant of the divine such as Belru would take upon this cursed form and infiltrate hell, serve as one of them while taking them all out one by one, demons would be destroyed and humanity would be saved from selling their souls. Jorah informed him of the plans to follow. The angels have reason to believe through visions that a demon would walk the earth for the very first time. Jorah said that they have been exploring curses and monster transformations in hell, and this would be the first time that they could test it. Since Belru was so strong in his faith, and with the angel Jorah guiding him, his mind or memories would not be lost. This option was a much safer bet, to use Belru for the curse rather than a demon picking someone at random. Belru said yes in a heartbeat, not because it was the righteous thing to do, because he began falling in love with Jorah. The more time they spent together, the more she shared the plan with him, his path in hell, what he needed to do. The young man was smitten by the angel, and for the very first time ever, in all the timelines that existed, an angel began having feelings for a human. A relationship between an angel and a human, let alone a werewolf, is forbidden for obvious reasons. However, Belru saw these trials as a challenge, and if he successfully completed the challenge, then he would use that to justify his case for marrying Jorah. The things people do for love. Now, for those of you who have watched the Curse of the Werewolf special that I did back in December, then you would remember that I called the angels douchebags. In this prophecy, there was a hidden clause. If Belru was successful in destroying the demons in hell, the angels would have no one stopping them from destroying humanity, something Jorah didn't know. And if Belru failed the trials, the angels were going to kill him and Jorah, since she was the one that vouched for him. Lose-lose situation really. A few months passed and Jorah's vision came to light. Thus her foresight was written onto a stone tablet in heaven. A demon had actually walked the earth for the first time. Thankfully and carefully manipulating the situation, the trail led the demon to the jungle. When the demon entered, Belru could not hide the fear of what was going to happen, despite him knowing. The wildlife and the barbarians ran to attack the demon and save Belru, but the demon held out his long staff and cursed the jungle. The curse did not have an effect on the wildlife, rather wounded them, but it changed the barbarians. Their eyes swelled, turning red with tiny veins running down their face. Their teeth grew long and sharp while their stomach rumbled. Belru never saw this part in his nightmares, nor did Jorah, who was hiding behind the foliage, watching everything unfold. Before the young man could back out, the curse fell upon Belru, turning him into a werewolf. This was a painful, torturous experience, but his mind remained intact, his faith still strong as ever, and his love for Jorah unwavered. The demon escorted him to the portal, and just before walking through, Belru the werewolf looked at Jorah behind the foliage and gave a warm smile. This was a message without spoken word, that everything was going to be okay, that he would destroy the demons in hell and everything evil in this world would come to an end. The angel looked worried and petrified that if everything went wrong, Belru would die. The only way that Jorah escaped the jungle that day was because the barbarians were too busy devouring the wildlife. Ravenous, voracious, wild, cannibalistic monsters were now eating the animals they once coexisted with. The more they ate, the more hungrier they became. The animals fought back, killing some of the barbarians, but there were too many of them. Their strength was amplified, their speed enhanced, and this menacing, troublesome rage drove them to insanity. So much so that even after the smallest of insects were eaten, the barbarians began ripping out pieces of their own flesh, eating it, hoping the hunger subsided. The strange, unknown behavior afflicted onto the barbarians was known as the curse of cannibalism. The angel could have stopped it right then and there, but her hesitancy was justified. One slight change and the entire timeline could shift. Unfortunately, folks, Ragnar's telling of the story was interrupted. The tentacle-like monster clan that he killed when taking Victor to the land of Freya had now reached the Harrow in numbers, summoning monsters from the dead again. This was the work of the crones, which meant they were near. The White Wolf said,
I have received more unwanted visitors in the past week than I have in 100 years. Literally.
Victor got ready to demolish these ugly creatures, but Ragnar told him otherwise.
I've got this. Do not waste your energy on this filth. You're going to need it for the jungle. I wish you well, kid, I really do. Make haste now.
As Ragnar pointed to the direction the jungle was at.
The elf, dwarf, and witch will meet you there.
Thus Victor ran like the wind, the cool breeze ruffling through his thick, long grey fur. A million thoughts flowed through his mind. The trials, Belru, the angel Jorah. But wasn't Jorah the final demon creature stated in the prophecy book? Why or how did she become a demon? What happened to Belru? Last but not least, Victor thought, how the hell was he going to find this damn tablet? Victor reached the jungle and was taken aback by the size of it. It was one thing trying to picture it from a story, but standing in front of it, the werewolf felt like an ant. That smell. There was a foul odor of death and decay that blew like a gush of wind and stung Victor's nose. The werewolf felt that dark energy thriving in this place. He felt that weight pressing down on his shoulders. He felt nervous. Then a portal with purple fiery sparks and orbs shooting out opened near Victor. The werewolf took a battle stance, prepared to claw his way at whatever emerged from the portal. But rather than being met by demons or monsters, it was a startled Myra holding up her hands.
Holy moly, you scared me.
As Victor apologized. The witch then stood next to the werewolf looking at the portal as the allies began walking through one by one. Myra started introducing them. First off were the werewolves, natural-born alphas of their respective packs. While not a special class, not like Victor or Ragnar, meaning they couldn't talk, but they were strong in their own right. The first werewolf went by the name Boston Ross, a tall and lean dark brown werewolf similar to Belru, his eyes large and deep like staring into the abyss. His body covered in scars, showing the experience of countless of battles. Boston Ross was the oldest of the 5 werewolves, which meant that he was the strongest. The second in the group was Jerry Fields, a grey werewolf much lighter shade than Victor. Strong and while tall did not appear so, since he had the animalistic hunch stance, the same stance that werewolves take when they're ready to engage in an attack. Mr. Fields was always prepared to fight and never ever let his guard down. Third werewolf went by the name Hurricane, his body covered in thick black fur darker than the night sky. There was a long scar starting from the eyebrow ridge, making its way to the bottom of the eye. A nasty scar which told a story of a nastier fight. Fourth and fifth werewolves were Elsie Scott and Raymond Burge, much leaner werewolves specializing in their speed and agility rather than sheer power. For this particular mission, these werewolves had the highest chance of survival. Raymond Burge and Elsie Scott were the first members that agreed to join Victor when Myra approached them. Safe to say their bravery is unmatched. Let's hope their skills are too. Next were the witches. Samantha, a beautiful witch with hazel color eyes. She wore a long black dress which complemented the color of her hair in a bun. Her skills in the jungle would be highly useful, specializing in the powers of space and time, being taught by none other than Myra herself. The witch had brought along 5 other of her fellow classmates, willing to fight for Victor. Samantha made acquaintances with the group and seemed to be the friendliest. The second witch, named Sasha, specialized in fire. Her lipstick scarlet, matching her long dress, fingernails, and pointy hat. Her eyes looked greenish-gray in the moonlight. Sasha softly snapped her fingers, almost practicing and honing her skills just before entering the jungle. Every time that she snapped her fingers, there was a fireball that hovered over her hand and then slowly vanished. The witch had brought along 6 others, having the same skills taught to them by her. The next member was the only warlock in the group, a muscular black man named Aholu. His specialties weren't like the witches, instead used his powers through spellcasting. We then move on to the next member of the group, a pale man with short hair, sunken eyes, slender and cold. This was the only vampire from Cascada willing to help Victor on his mission, Shadow Moon. Incredible speed and years of battle experience, useful in helping Victor retrieve the stone tablet. It was unfortunate that Cascada was filled with the most despicable and evil vampires roaming the street corners, but Shadow Moon was one of the few they could trust. Then the elves and dwarves. This team was led by a 1.3 meter tall dwarf named Marston. He wore heavy, highly crafted armor, wielding a sledgehammer axe. It was a miracle for someone so small not only to carry the armor, but the weapon itself. This dwarf was personally vouched for by Berthold. At his sides, Marston had 5 elves and 5 dwarves ready to fight for him. Berthold and Eleanor, the last 2 members, walked through the portal just a few minutes before Myra closed it. They stood confused, looked around and asked Victor where Ragnar was. The Grey Werewolf then explained the monster clan showing up in the village. The elf and dwarf looked at each other worryingly and ran. Victor, now also confused, tried stopping the duo by telling them Ragnar would be more than fine facing those creatures by himself. After all, he was the one that told Victor to leave. But the elf, with her concerned tone of voice, said,
If that was the case, Ragnar would be here by now. Forgive us, Grey Wolf, but something is terribly wrong. We hope our allies can serve you just as well as we would.
Berthold and Eleanor made haste to the harrow. Myra then asked Victor.
Hey, you ready to begin?
The Grey Werewolf looked at all the allies, kindly nodding his head as a gesture of thanks. But his eyes could not hide the troublesome thoughts. This group was young. Most of them have seen too few winters. Most of them might not even walk out the jungle. Hell, Victor might not even walk out the jungle. The werewolf felt like he was leading sheep to the slaughter. As Myra was about to lead the team into the jungle, Victor gently pulled her aside and whispered, Listen, if everything Ragnar told me is true, we are most likely going to die in this place. So we need to move as silently as possible. But if things go south, you all need to get out of here at once.
Hell no, Victor, I am not leaving.
That is my condition, witch. That if things go south, you give me your word. You will get yourself and all these people out of the jungle. Myra tried arguing, tried convincing Victor, but he never budged. Finally, she agreed. The werewolf and the witch did a pinky promise, then spoke to the allies, warning them about the jungle. Stealth was key for this mission. Victor described the tablet from Ragnar's description, so the allies knew what to look for. The Grey Wolf also told them that every group that splits up must have a witch with them, easier for teleportation purposes. Thus, 33 members, werewolves, witches, elves, dwarves, a vampire and a warlock, had entered the deep, dark and frightening Jungle of Belru. Once the night ends and the moon fades away, the werewolves will change back to the human selves and the vampire will burn. But most importantly, they entered the jungle, not knowing if they would ever come out again. While I hate deviating from the story, which is why my videos are fast-paced and straight to the point, I feel like I need to disclose the next part. Some of you that have been mentioned in the story are unfortunately going to die in the next chapter. Now, when I wrote the death scenes, I used unnamed characters first. Then, I wrote down the names of those who wanted to be featured in the story and chose them at random. Hence, please do not feel like I am signaling you out in any way. This is merely a fantasy horror story, yes? Please treat it as such. Victor the werewolf led the way. His team right behind him, all together for now, keeping a stealthy approach. Their bodies relaxed but leaned slightly forward, their eyes wandering around and their footsteps so gentle and quiet, like they were trying to avoid invisible thumbtacks on the ground. It became increasingly difficult not to throw up. The rotten smell would make anyone's stomach turn, but they had to fight through it. A cough, loud snuff, or even trying to clear one's throat would be a death wish. However, the further they traveled in, the allies understood why the jungle stunk. Victor saw mutilated bodies, some suspended on the trees, some spread out on the ground, and some piled in heaps. Limbs ripped and chewed, clothing torn and thrown, and hair everywhere. The werewolf also saw skeletons lying around, femurs, tibias, tarsals, rib cages, scapulars, flesh eaten squeaky clean off the bone. If anything, the stories told about this place did not even come close to actually being there. However, the next part was ironic. Since Victor turned into a werewolf, there was always that struggle with the human trying to tame the beast. But in this case, despite them being one entity, it felt like the werewolf tried to tame the human Victor's rage was at a summer, then gradually rose and rose until his body shook with anger. So many people slaughtered in this jungle, so much of death and destruction, but the werewolf needed to keep his calm. He turned back to the allies and saw the expressions of disgust, pure shock and horror plastered on their faces. Silently, he used hand gestures to point at the directions that he needed them to go in. Thus, the 33 members had now split up. Jerry Fields had a lower stance than anyone else in the group, gently sniffing the ground and using his heightened sight, trying to look for the tablet. There were 2 younger witches with him, accompanied by 2 elves and 2 dwarves, scouting the areas in their own ways. Raymond Burge and Elsie Scott had a similar group, but these werewolves were born for stealth. They moved so quickly yet made no sounds whatsoever. They covered much more ground than the rest, but the further they walked into the jungle, the bigger it seemed to get. Boston Ross, the dark brown werewolf, and Samantha Daniels, the witch, led their own team of elves. They were thankful that elvish warriors weighed less than a feather, which meant that even if they ran, no one would hear them. Perfect scouts, but still no luck in finding the tablet. Marston and Sasha led a larger group with a mix of elves and dwarves, slowly looking behind the plants and trees, trying to cross the darkened foliage of the jungle. Marston was short, therefore found it easier to maneuver through and around the trees and plants. Sasha shared just a tad bit of light from a tiny flame on her fingertip, but still no luck. Time was flying by and there was no sign of the tablet. Shadow Moon, Hurricane, and Aholu had a group of their own. The young vampire noticed movement behind the foliage. He walked slowly towards the source of disturbance, carefully and cautiously. And there it was, the stone tablet. It seemed to be just stuck in the air, literally. The warlock and the dark black werewolf remained behind, while Shadow Moon gently reached for the tablet. Then, the once eerie silence looming the jungle was no more. Drums, slow, loud and filled with bass. With each beat, the allies felt the anxiety building up in their chest. The tempo increased, the sound louder, and the jungle suddenly felt much smaller than everyone thought. Smaller in the sense that they felt trapped. Victor and Myra's eyes widened with panic as they yelled at everyone to get out of the jungle. Shadow Moon grabbed the tablet as quickly as possible, but found it stuck. It wasn't stuck by vines or branches. It was held. The stone tablet was never in the air. Then, a pair of eyelids opened up in front of them, revealing red eyes peeking through the foliage. A camouflaged barbarian then stood up, almost the same height of the tallest trees in the jungle. Shadow Moon, Hurricane, and Aholu panicked. This was the largest creature they had ever seen in their lives. Lightning quick punches from the vampire, massive blows from the werewolf, and poisonous spells cast by the warlock. Impressive, strong, skillful attacks, all in vain. The giant monster barbarian grabbed Shadow Moon with one arm, like the claw in the toy machines trying to retrieve a teddy bear. The young vampire tried escaping, fighting bravely, but had lost feeling throughout his body. The monster barbarian, while holding Shadow Moon in the air, used both palms and squeezed his head until it popped like a watermelon. Then all hell broke loose. This was the beginning of the end. It looked like a zombie outbreak, but instead of zombies, they were vicious, ferocious, cannibal barbarians. Despite the jungle being so massive, it still felt small once the barbarians swarmed through. The warlock and the hurricane tried fighting the barbarian and did wound it, but this led them to being smashed on the ground like insects. Victor ran towards the giant, noticing the stone tablet was kept in a pouch located on the side of his hip. Myra and Samantha began opening portals for the allies to escape, but each time they tried to enter, the barbarians swarmed them like bees. Some elves were ripped apart in the most gruesome ways possible in seconds. Some dwarves, while still breathing, were being devoured by the barbarians. So vile, vicious and ruthless that even the smallest piece of meat on their carcass never went to waste. Sasha the witch used her firepower to burn the barbarians near her. They fell to the ground sizzling like a steak placed into a hot pan filled with oil. The witch then had an idea. Why not burn down the damn jungle? Myra yelled from the other side, telling the witch to conserve her energy. The jungle will not burn, she said. It has a protection shield from Belru. Do not harm the jungle in any way, she said. Whatever you do to it will be reversed to you. The allies were decreasing in numbers. All hope seemed to be lost. Victor the werewolf had his hands full with the giants. Myra sent Nala, the giant serpent, to protect as many as she could while sending projectile orbs at the barbarians. Sasha, technically a human flamethrower, was now getting tired. Samantha Daniels could feel the blood pouring out from her nose. Marston, the brutal warrior dwarf, took out barbarians in hordes, swinging his sledgehammer axe wildly and yelling at them. As strong as he was, no one could keep up the pace of carrying the armor while using such a heavy weapon. The moment he slowed down, the barbarians jumped on him and ripped him to shreds. Boston Ross and Jerry Fields back to back fought off the barbarians valiantly, but they too felt the exhaustion and the hopelessness settling in. The elves had fired so many arrows that it ran out. The dwarves had fought so much and so quickly that they couldn't breathe anymore. Raymond and Scott, both the fastest werewolves among the allies, did their best to carry as many elves, dwarves, and witches out the jungle. But with each trip back and forth, there were more being slaughtered than saved. Everyone knew they couldn't keep this up any longer. Boston Ross and Jerry Fields made a run for it while slaying barbarians along the way. Then, just before exiting, the barbarians caught up to them. The werewolves fought and bit and clawed their way, but Jerry Fields had sacrificed himself for Boston Ross to escape. Myra, with her nose bleeding and tears rolling down her face from the sheer horror, stood her ground. Her mind and body was giving up, but she never showed it. The flames being sent by Sasha wasn't strong anymore, and Samantha Daniels had no energy left. Just as those two young witches were going to faint, Raymond Burge and Elsie Scott grabbed them and escaped the jungle. From all the allies that have entered, Raymond Burge, Elsie Scott, Sasha, Samantha Daniels, and Boston Ross were the only ones that made it out alive. The werewolves were going to re-enter the jungle to fetch Myra, but a wisp of dark smoke flew past them within seconds and then entered the jungle. A gush of wind whistled through the foliage. This dark black smoke smothered the barbarians, circling them, and when it moved on, the cannibal beast fell to the ground with their throats slit open. The barbarians were being cut down, and while Fillion Hunt was late, he was now in the Jungle of Belru. Myra's projectile orbs weren't as big and powerful anymore. Nala the snake had vanished into thin air from the lack of energy the witch had from keeping her summoned. Within seconds, the vampire cop used his 6-inch sharp fingernails and cut down the barbarians surrounding her in a swirl motion, then grabbed Myra and took her out of the jungle. Fillion left her in the arms of the werewolves waiting outside, then bolted back in. The vampire needed to find Victor ASAP, hoping the stone tablet was in his hands. However, the barbarians stopped like they were frozen. Those cannibalistic monsters felt fear after a very long time. But why weren't they moving? What had terrified them? The barbarian horde was standing in a circle, and in front of them lied the severed heads of the 5 giants. Those heads landed at that spot when Victor kicked them like footballs. The vampire then saw Victor walking from behind the foliage. The werewolf, however, looked terrifying. His muscles much larger, filled with lactic acid. His eyes were no more yellow but rather amber. His eerie smile sent a chill down Fulian's spine. A smile so creepy that it stretched his jaw, showing how sharp his teeth really were. Victor was holding the stone tablet in his hand. When he looked at Fulian, that evil smile slowly diminished. This entire exchange happened within a few seconds, while the barbarians were grunting and speaking their own language from witnessing the severed heads of their giant leaders. The werewolf and the vampire never said a word, they just looked at each other. Victor then gave the stone tablet to Fulian. The vampire then gently grabbed it while looking into Victor's eyes, witnessing it changing rapidly from amber to red in succession. Amber to red, amber to red, amber to red. The werewolf then calmly nodded his head while looking at Fulian, and the vampire returned the gesture. No spoken word, just communication with the eyes, and somehow Fulian knew exactly what Victor was going to do. The vampire cop with the stone tablet in his hand ran at the speed of light, slicing and dicing however many barbarians in his path, making his way out the jungle. Time seemed to slow down for Victor. His muscles were screaming after fighting the giant barbarian. It was only for a brief moment that he held on to the stone tablet, but he still felt that sensation running down to his core. The training wheels had finally come off. The barbarians seemed to be running in slow motion. The tribal chants, grunts, and battle cries they made sounded so soft to Victor. What was this weird feeling traveling through his body? Why wasn't he escaping the jungle? The werewolf looked ahead and saw no sign of Fulian, then closed his eyes and gave a warm smile. The vampire was safe. Then that same smile slowly changed into a frown. The allies that had nothing to do with this mess have lost their lives today. The barbarians have killed yet again. Victor's eyes remained closed. The noises the barbarians made were drowned out by screams. Screams of anguish of those who have lost their lives in the jungle. In Victor's mind, he saw the skeletons of families, fathers, mothers, children, pieces of flesh and body parts of those recently murdered lying everywhere. Folk that were innocent, folk that tried to live life, had been slaughtered by these monsters. He heard the children's cries. He heard the mother's screams filled with pain and fear. He heard the fathers being tortured, and now the werewolf clenched his fist. Victor was fast. Now was the time to run. Now was the time to get out, and yet he chose not to. The werewolf took a deep breath in, then exhaled slowly. Victor was almost in the barbarian's grasp, but then he jumped backwards onto a rock. Victor looked at his sharp claws while moving it around and then gave a smile. These razor-sharp claws would now serve as his scalpels. The barbarians in front of him were nothing more but tendons, ligaments, and arteries waiting to be cut. The jungle was now his surgical room. The only difference was that he never needed to stitch them back together again. The barbarians needed to die a horrible death. Fulian the vampire made it out the jungle. The stone tablet tucked inside his long black coat, which now looked like crimson with so much of blood covering him. His hair messy, his body tired, but his eyes had nothing behind them. Myra ran to embrace him, but he stopped her by holding the stone tablet in front of him. "Keep it safe and leave," he said. Myra was confused, and so were the allies. Fulian looked up at the sky with only a few minutes remaining for sunrise. The vampire then thanked everyone that stood in front of him. then suggested to one of the witches, either Sasha or Samantha, to open a portal for them to return at home at once. As confused as they all were while looking behind the vampire to see if Victor made it out, they had no choice but to leave. Myra then thanked their allies one last time, a heartfelt and graceful thank you for risking their lives on this mission, something that will never be forgotten. Once the portal closed and the allies returned to their homes, the witch then turned to Fillion.
What happened to you, Fillion? Whose blood is that?
She said, looking at all the blood soaked into his clothes. The vampire said, "It's a long story, one that I will not share, one that I will not be judged for, one that I would like to forget." "You can leave," he said, his voice slow and calm. "What happens to the stone tablet in Victor's absence is your responsibility. Farewell." The vampire never looked at Myra this entire time, perhaps still angry with her for hiding the secret of her dark magic, or perhaps whatever Fillion has been through in the past day or two had changed him. The vampire then began walking away. Myra said,
Fillion, please. If you don't want to tell me what happened, that's fine. If you don't want to open up to me again, that's fine, I can take it. But please, we need to get Victor. He's stuck in that jungle with those ruthless barbarians.
The vampire continued walking away with his blood-covered back facing the witch. He remembered the look Victor gave him a few minutes ago inside the jungle. That deep, dark, and menacing look in his eyes that spoke volumes. Fillion said he'll be fine. Besides, you did not see what I did. Fillion Hunt had this cheeky smirk plastered on his face. As the sun rose, the vampire walked into the shadows and said, "You got it backwards, Myra. Victor isn't stuck in the jungle with the barbarians. They are trapped in the jungle with him."